Hi everyone, I'm Fazal Rizvi. I'm an artist based in Pakistan, and I'm here at Jameel Art Center for this exhibition that is curated by Murtaza Wali called Proposals for a Memorial to Partition. And today I'm here in the Jameel Library to talk about this book or talk through this book, Long Night Stands with Lonely, Lonely Boys by Augustine Paredes. This is a book that I just came across yesterday, and it's something that I find deeply moving, and again also just because of the way it's sort of made, the materiality of it, the texture. It's kind of there's something really tender and soft about it, even though a lot of times I don't like to use the word tender because I feel like it's a word that's kind of being used a lot lately, but there is really no other way to describe this book, at least materially and textually, and textually and textural wise as well. Um, and what I want to do is that I do not particularly want to read anything specific from the book, at least not text. I might read a small excerpt, but what I want to do is actually read the images in the book or read through the materiality of the book because I find that really interesting and how that ties in with what he's trying to do. So I may sort of like ramble through images and may share sort of anecdotes of my own as I go along. So the book, even the cover of the book is quite tender, and through the cover, which is slightly translucent, you see an image of a man or a boy reclining or sleeping, looking away from you. We don't know who this is. And as we go along, the very first image that I'm drawn to, or the very first image we encounter inside, is an image of a hand resting on a body. And I don't know if this hand and the body is of the same person, or the hand belongs to somebody else and is resting on someone else's body. Um, that is kind of ambiguous. And the one thing that sort of also further draws me in is this image, or actually a tattoo on the body, where there's a cupid kissing another cupid while holding each other. So there's something really sweet and intimate about the image itself, where a hand is touching a skin, and the whole image is kind of slightly grainy, and there's yeah, um, and then we move along, and there's the foreword and preface that comes, and then we come to this image which is facing, or it's actually a collage of images, and it's facing it's facing a page where there is text written in actually handwritten text. And this image is kind of interesting because it's a collage, and the images in the back are not necessarily very clear, and they're black and white. But the image that is superimposed on them is kind of interesting, which I'm assuming is it's an image of Augustine himself, and one cannot tell whether um, this is taken by him or taken by somebody else. It's quite up close. We see half of his face, and the image is slightly blurry. So yeah, the camera or the phone camera, I'm assuming, was so up close that the image sort of came blurred. So it kind of speaks of a certain kind of intimacy, and it would be interesting to sort of know whether he took the image or somebody else did. But what is interesting about this image is that even though we only see half of his face, his eyes are closed, and so there is this. It's this moment where he seems to be sort of looking inward, and turning inward, or and that in a way is kind of sets the tone for this book. Then we move to the next page, and the spread is we see a sea, we see the sea, and there's an image of a boy, which again I'm assuming is of Augustine, sort of superimposed on the sea, sort of like going back into the horizon. And at first, when I looked at this image, it almost looked like it was a bedspread, or one could sort of also assume that this is a bedspread that is sort of spreading into the horizon. There's a line on top which says, "I slouching through bed spaces." So one could also almost sort of like imagine the sea as a sea of beds, or these beds sort of like, yeah, uh, sort of, yeah, in the horizon, these endless sort of bedspreads. And as I was looking, I think the second time around when I came back to this image, only then I noticed that there's a body floating in the sea. And then it's that in itself, there's something really lovely about this. Again, like I think that there's something really calming and soothing about whenever we sort of float in water, whether it's in a swimming pool or even in the sea. And again, this is he's alone. He, or I don't know. I'm for some reason, because this work is autobiographical. So a lot of the images that I'm seeing here, I'm automatically just assuming that it's him. But it's just this one body floating in space, floating in the sea, and yeah, whether this body is alone, or feels alone, feels lonely, or feels content. Not exactly sure. Um, then we move ahead, and the next set of images that we come across, we see these set of luggage trolleys, which one usually encounters at airports. And while that may be overtly the subject of this image also seems to have a strong flash that is making the subject visible. And that is something that I always find interesting, like Flash as a subject, or Flash as a protagonist, or Flash as an activator. And I really like that about this image. And this image is also then facing another image of the sea and the horizon line of the sea, painted in black and white. Um, we move further ahead, and I now see a figure. This is a photograph of somebody who's sleeping on the bed, um, looking away from the camera. And yeah, this is somebody's home. I don't know whose, whether it is the artist, whether it's somebody else's, somebody he slept with. Um, but again, this is gesture of sort of like looking away, and sort of like the whole life sort of spread out, and this lone figure in space. And what does that do? And right next to it, right at the end of right at the end of the bed, there is a painting or an image that is placed on the wall, framed image of the sky. And again, sort of like looking at this sort of like space which seems cramped up with objects of the everyday, of yeah, of everyday living, and then to sort of see this image of the sky, which kind of in some ways opens up the image, or lets the image breathe a little or dream a little. I kind of really like that sort of juxtaposition of the inside, the intimate, and the sort of outside sort of opening, even though it's just a small sort of tiny fragment where we see that sky framed image. Um, then we come to this image uh, of a wall, perhaps in a public space, with all these posters, or like sort of brochures which are sort of pasted on a wall, which says "Partition available, Fahdi Burjaman Karama." And this again, like, yeah, this is something that I kind of encountered the first time when I came to Dubai in 2019. And I'd gone to sort of meet a framer. Well, I'd come for a show, and I'd gone to this framer's workshop to get work framed, and this was somewhere between Sharjah and Dubai. And I saw a lot of these posters, sort of like these kind of posters, sort of advertised for specific communities to find housing, to find space, to find spaces within space, right? I mean, and something that one doesn't necessarily overtly see, or it's made invisible, And I think back then when I saw these kind of like images or posters on walls, or this kind of information being disseminated, it was specifically for South Asian communities, I think. um, so for me it was also again very sort of telling in that moment of this place. And for some reason it also, like, just thinking of the previous image and sort of also thinking of these kind of spaces, which are shared, where people have to cramp up, and be together and live together. It kind of reminded me of this film that I once saw, or actually saw more than once, by a Taiwanese director, I believe. I don't remember the name right now, but the name of the film was "I Don't Want to Sleep Alone," and it's one of those really remarkable films, that have really stayed with me, because the premise of the film in a way really is that it kind of like shows all these different, like, there are different sort of protagonists or characters in the film, and I think almost all of them are from different migrant communities. I don't even remember where the film is set anymore. And So they're all from different migrant communities, and and they don't speak each other's language. And the whole film sort of like has these multiple sort of moments where which kind of like, yeah, it shows like moments of intimacy, between people who are not able to communicate, but yet there are these other sort of like ways of communicating and being, and that come through. And there's particularly this one scene where I think one of the characters, I think, who was Bengali, I believe, I could be wrong, but definitely South Asian, who was injured, and he had to be sort of taken or helped out, actually to take a piss. And there's this moment where this other character who cannot communicate to him, and he takes him, and he unbuttons his pant and like helps him sort of like, yeah, like comes from the behind and holds him, and lets him relieve himself. And yeah, that's and there's this strange kind of intimacy between these two characters, both men, that is shared in that moment, which really kind of stayed with me. And I don't know why I'm talking about this, but just again, sort of thinking of these kind of like places, that are present here, where people are sharing, people are living, and just to sort of imagine sort of what happens where bodies are so close to one another, what kind of intimacies or relations or contact, um, uh, especially within these migrant communities, sort of like, yeah, comes up. I mean, this is just something that I'm imagining and sort of like thinking about, but yeah. um, and again, like, the image after this, which I find really interesting, is this. It's possibly between Augustine and his mother, and I think they're in conversation, possibly over a video phone call, and yeah, there are two images. I'm assuming it's the mother, because there are also some letters or some moments within the text parts of this book where he addresses his mother, and yeah, and she's smiling. She looks kind of happy to see him. He's not smiling as much, but he looks kind of content. There are also sort of like these sort of like moments within the book where there's certain sort of like texts, kind of like poetry, which kind of are not sort of bound, but they're just sort of like placed as paper, within certain sort of like moments within the book, which is really nice, because then it also sort of like the book kind of becomes this object, or a collection of objects, and it's not just a book, but it's a collection of objects, collection of thoughts, collection of poems, and which is really sort of lovely. Um, we see an image of a cancelled, card, a residence permit card for Augustine, and I'm not sure why it's cancelled. Maybe the date is over, or I don't understand the sort of legalities or these kind of things in UAE. Um, moving ahead, so the book also sort of like travels through all these different places where Augustine has traveled through, where he's met people, where he's slept with people. And there's this one image where we see a naked body of a man, again, looking away from the camera, and on a bed. And along with the image, and the image is also kind of bleached out. So the idea was not necessarily to sort of like, yeah, make it about the body itself, but just sort of give a sense of this moment. And along with it, there's a map, or there's a route that is marked, which sort of gives a sense of all these different places or different points, perhaps on a journey, and starting from Davao, Stockholm, Yerevan, Beirut, Tbilisi, Dubai, Paris, Berlin, and Helsinki. And I'm assuming these are places, or these are places where that he references, and he further talks about. He talks about intimate encounters and meeting certain people in these places. Um, then there's this really lovely spread, which is a set of two images. There's one image which sort of like bleeds out in the spread, and then there's another image sort of superimposed on it. The larger image that we see is of a bedspread, and the way the bedspread appears, like there seem to be more than one concentric circles of like formed within the bedsheet, which almost sort of suggests in a way that there were more than one bodies sort of on this bed, perhaps. This is just my reading of it. I could be totally wrong. And there's this really lovely soft light. Perhaps it very much looks like a morning light, which is sort of lighting up the bed sheet diagonally across. Yeah, I don't think there's a body in this, or maybe there is. So because there's a part of this image which is ambiguous, and on top of this, there's another image of a boy, a man, superimposed, again looking away from the camera. So this is a device that's coming again and again. Uh, this sort of not sort of giving into the gaze of the camera, and looking away from the camera. So it's not necessarily about the subject, or it's not portrait of the people, but it's to think through these encounters, and not necessarily name the encounters or frame each encounter as in a peculiar way, but to just sort of think through them as something that punctuate a journey. Then we encounter another spread, which is of a torso. I think it ends right above the navel. I'm assuming, at least that's how I read the image. And it's lightly peppered hair through the image. And again, like something nice that I often find about like these kind of close-ups of the body, these kind of intimate gaze at a body, because then it also just stops being the body itself. Like I almost read this also as a landscape, as land, as space, and that's again like our bodies are not just our bodies. They're markers of space. They're one can think about geography and journey and place and so much more through them. And then we have this image again, another image of a boy looking away. And I'm not sure exactly where this is, but given the order of the book, this is probably in Yerevan. And yeah, it's a blue room, blue walls. Doesn't look like Dubai for sure. Um, and the bedsheet is strangely like the bedsheet also has a blue tint, but I think it's white, but it's that kind of white, which is more blue, which usually tends to give a very cold feeling, but somehow there's something really nice and warm and comfortable about this image, about this gaze at a body that is possibly sleeping. Is it a body just sleeping, or is it a body looking away? I'm not sure if it's actively looking away, but that seems to be something that is also present throughout the book. Yeah, so I don't know, yeah, whether it's consciously done or it's unconscious. When we go through Tbilisi, the journey through places and uh, encountering people, meeting people. Um, there's one I stop at this one image which I really like. It's quite a dark image, and it's looking down at two hands. So you'll really primarily see the two hands because everything else is dark, and the yeah. So you see this faint image of two of hands, possibly of the same person, and one hand is slightly holding or pinching the finger of the other. And I kind of particularly like this image because again, that going back to one of the earlier images where Augustine's eyes were closed and he was looking inwards. And in this case as well, yeah, this in a way kind of makes, yeah, I don't know, this is maybe making me think of the idea of being aware of your body, or in a way being like, in the end, what you're left with is yourself, your body. That's what you turn to. So this is again one turning to oneself, one's body turning to itself, uh, because I don't know, that's what stays. We also see these images where Augustine is photographing himself. They seem to be images where he's photographing himself in the mirror, and they're also blurry. So there's the blurring of the body and blurring of the gaze in a way. Um, and there's this one particular image where there's a further sort of blurring, um, and and this body seems to be wearing a harness, a leather harness. I'm again assuming that this is the artist himself because I'm assuming, especially the images where he's taking images of himself in the mirror, are definitely him. And I'm not sure whether this image was blurred after having been taken or it was blurred in the process of taking, um, because both could also insinuate different things. Um, I also wanted to read, there's one part that I wanted to read, um, where it says, "It gets lonely here, but there is a dark place I run to look for anyone to give me a slight chance of happiness. After many grinder messages and Tinder plans, we finally meet. I take my clothes off, and they would whisper many beautiful things. Your skin looks nice. You are smooth. You feel like fire. You are warm. I would marry you tomorrow, only to soften me up, let me bloom and leave after. Occasionally, there would be a boy who would stay for many mornings and warm cups of coffee. He would stay long, only to tell me that this place is not for him. So I let him leave. But before that, I brew him one last cup of coffee, wrap his clothes, and give him letters in case he looks back and remembers that this dark place was a happy place sometimes. Other times, a boy would ask, 'Would you like a hit?' It would feel like heaven in this hell. The sparks from the lighter would brighten up the room. Sometimes, a boy returns and starts looking for other things. I morph into a person I don't recognize. I change my name, bleach my hair, put holes on my ears, gain a few pounds. Add more leg days, sweat a lot, dance a lot, be a little less ugly, and go back for more lonesome love.